air defenses that I've outlined in 9/11 War Games in great detail, which, everything just happened to fail on the morning of September 11th in a way that made this incredibly unlikely thing possible. Well, now we're getting the failure of intelligence sort of narrative being painted with this global pandemic. The NCMI woulda, shoulda, coulda picked it up. Oh, maybe they did pick it up, but it's being covered up by the Trump admin because they're a bunch of bumbling fools. Again, I think we know where that tends to go. But, I mean, is there something closer to a smoking gun that would show, no, this wasn't an intelligence failure, it was failed on purpose? Is there anything that would point to that? Well, actually, there is. Trump ended Plandemic early warning program 2 months before the globally spreading coronavirus pandemic began. 2 months before the novel coronavirus probably began spreading in Wuhan, China, the Trump administration ended a $200 million pandemic early warning program aimed at training scientists in China and other countries to detect and respond to such a threat. The project, launched by the U.S. Agency for International Development in 2009, identified 1,200 different viruses that had the potential to erupt into pandemics, including more than 160 novel coronaviruses. The initiative, called PREDICT, PREDICT, it's an acronym, also trained and supported staff in 60 foreign laboratories, including the Wuhan lab that identified 2019 nCoV, the new coronavirus that causes COVID-19. Fieldwork ceased when the funding ran out in September, and organizations that worked on the PREDICT program laid off dozens of scientists and analysts. Later on in the article, they say the PREDICT project, launched in response to the 2005 H5N1 bird flu scare, gathered specimens from more than 10,000 bats and 2,000 other mammals in search of dangerous viruses. They detected about 1,200 viruses that could spread from wild animals to humans, signaling pandemic potential. More than 160 of them were novel coronaviruses, much like 2019 nCoV, now known as SARS-CoV-2. They also took blood samples from people in rural China and learned that in living among wildlife, they had been exposed to coronaviruses, a clear sign that if those viruses spread easily among humans, they could take off. That raised the red flag, said Mazet. Coronaviruses were jumping easily across species lines and were ones to watch for epidemics and pandemics, she said. The program also trained nearly 7,000 people across medical and agricultural sectors in 30 countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to help them detect deadly new viruses on their own. One of those labs was the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the Chinese lab that quickly identified SARS-CoV-2, Mazet said. The Wuhan lab received U.S. aid funding for equipment, and PREDICT coordinators connected the scientists there with researchers in other countries in order to synchronize tracking of novel viruses before SARS-CoV-2. The project's second funding cycle concluded on September 30th, 2019, less than 2 months before the new coronavirus probably began spreading. It was granted a $0 6-month extension through March 2020 to write up final reports. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? The very program that was looking for, supposedly, trying to identify these novel spreading coronavirus and other types of viral threats, just was completely shut down. Its funding ended on September 30th, 2019, and from that point on, it was just writing reports based on outdated information. So, literally, September 30th, 2019, literally the day before, we are told, according to that Scott Ritter article, that scientists were able to determine that the most recent common ancestor for the coronavirus could be dated back to as early as October 1st, 2019. Well, here you go. September 30th, 2019, they stopped looking for the thing, and on October 1st, 2019, it appeared. And we'll get into how unlikely that is, considering how unlikely this SARS-CoV-2 supposedly is to have naturally evolved. But at any rate, pretty interesting. And then 2 weeks later, you have, on October 18th, the start of the Wuhan military games and Event 201. So it's starting to get to the point where you would have to be a crazy coincidence theorist to think there is no fire behind all this smoke. Oh, it's just all of these things just happen to line up at the exact same time. Wow, what an incredibly unlikely and incredibly unfortunate series of coincidences to take place all bada bing, bada boom, all together, right? So, okay, anyway, as I say, all of that can be fit into some sort of limited hangout narrative that still supports a lot of the official story, but does raise some very interesting questions that will at least get people thinking about the unlikelihood of some of the things that we're being asked to believe. Let's turn back to Magic Bullet's question specifically on the financial foreknowledge, to which some of the Corbett Report commenters had something to say. For example, Animals Aren't Food wrote, "In my opinion, the CEOs that step down are a strong indicator of foreknowledge of a plandemic. Up to that point, absent psychic powers, there was no way any one of those CEOs could have predicted an upcoming catastrophe to such an extent that they'd be willing to step down." And Mick adds, "I think almost crash of repo market into September 2019 is smoking gun. Uncle Sam wouldn't be able to get money if Fed didn't intervene at the time. Uncle Sam unable to get money in nowadays system means sky is falling down." Okay, so a couple of good points here. Firstly, yes, indeed, as Animals Aren't Food points out, there was an unprecedented number of CEOs resigning, not just in 2020, but in 2019. You don't have to step far out on a conspiracy theorist branch for that one. You can even go to NBC, which was reporting in November of 2019, why have more than 1,300 CEOs left their post in the past year, noting the absolutely unprecedented levels of CEOs' resignations that were taking place at that time throughout 2019. And that trend only accelerated from there. So by the time you get to February of 2020, you have CCN reporting CEOs quitting in record numbers could signal total stock market collapse. Well, here we are. Now, of course, part of that is past that window that we're talking about here, where clearly by January, February of 2020, it was quite obvious to people who were in positions to understand the global supply chain, etc., that a major economic disruption that could precipitate into complete stock market chaos and a global economic collapse, which is exactly what we're seeing, could play out. So you didn't exactly have to be psychic at that point, although obviously they were getting out when still there was relative calm. Oh, everything's okay, as we plunge into the Great Depression. But in 2019, certainly no one was expecting what is, well, I mean, people were expecting what is happening now. It's just not because of a globally spreading coronavirus pandemic, right? Right? Well, it's foreknowledge of some sort, I would say. The fact that an unprecedented number of CEOs were resigning last year, right before the Greatest Depression. But circumstantial at best, and again, case-by-case basis. Some of the resignations, I'm sure, were significant, some of which were probably not significant. I mean, a certain number of CEOs will resign in a given year, and you could nitpick at that, and blah, blah, blah. You're not going to change anyone's mind with that piece of information. More to the point, as MIK points out, the repo market, the repurchase agreement market, was going haywire in September of 2019, which hopefully you know something about. If not, you should go back to the article that I wrote about it for the newsletter back in October of last year, where I talked about QE4, which was beginning at that time, and I explained it at that time. But as recent Corbett Report guest John Titus points out in one of his most recent videos, that point in September 2019 was when the Fed began adding to its balance sheet again after trying to pare it down over the course of a year or two. Suddenly the balance sheet started rising again to the tune of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, now well into the trillions of dollars. But that was when the Fed started its interventions, and that shows that the craziness that started to play out was certainly in recent weeks cannot be blamed 100% on coronavirus shutdowns. No, there was major activity happening in September of 2019.
So what I'm scrubbing over now is the balance sheet of the Fed between late 2002 and the gray bar, which is the onset of the financial crisis. And one thing that you can see there very clearly is that the balance sheet never goes over, during that time, over $1 trillion. It's under $1 trillion that entire time. What you can't see there is that the assets on the balance sheet at that time are almost entirely U.S. Treasuries. Okay. That changes. That and the amount both changed during the financial crisis. And you can see here, this is September, this is the Lehman Brothers explodes and blows up, and the balance sheet goes with it. Two things changed at that time. One, the balance sheet goes up a lot. And two, the Fed begins taking on things other than U.S. Treasuries onto its balance sheet. In particular, it begins to buy lots of mortgage-backed securities. It buys other things too, but the mortgage-backed securities were the big one. Okay, the next thing that goes on is that you see the balance sheet continues to rise up to $4.5 trillion. I happen to know that it hits a high of 4.516 on January 14th, 2015. That was the high until recently. And the balance sheet keeps rising, notice, even though the financial crisis is supposedly over, the Fed's just packing more and more and more assets onto its balance sheet. And it is printing up reserves. The banks, in exchange for those reserves, supply assets to the Fed. And those assets, as I say, are mostly U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities right there, but also some other stuff. Now you can see here in beginning of 2018, the Fed begins to produce its balance sheet. It is selling U.S. Treasuries, selling mortgage-backed securities. Really what it's doing is letting those assets roll off and not buying any more of them. But the point is the Fed begins to roll down its balance sheet. It begins to reduce its balance sheet, trying to get its balance sheet back to normal. And then you can see that in September 11th, September 18th, the balance sheet begins to rise again. I'm going to blow this up so we can see it better. Yeah, September 18th. This here, starting on September 18th, this is when the New York Fed enters the repo market, repurchase agreements. The New York Fed enters the repo market and it drives up the balance sheet slightly. Well, in retrospect, it's quite slight. At the time, it seemed to be a big deal. And notice that this is well before anybody has heard of any coronavirus. So the balance sheet has already started to tick up appreciably well before we hear of coronavirus.
Once again, that's John Titus of the Best Evidence channel asking the question, why is the Federal Reserve lying about coronavirus? And make no mistake, the Federal Reserve is lying about coronavirus, like when it told us in its Ides of March 15th, 2020 press release that the current craziness and the injections of trillions is going on specifically to deal with coronavirus and specifically to help Main Street deal with the global economic shutdown. That's a double lie because, as John Titus pointed out in that video and in our subsequent follow-up conversation, which I hope you have seen by now, no, this money is not going to help out Main Street, demonstrably so. And secondarily, no, the trillions that they are now injecting didn't start in the wake of the coronavirus crisis. No, it started before this current pandemic freakout began, identifiably, demonstrably, documentably in September of 2019. Once again, I did write about this in the newsletter last year, in my editorial, Everything Gold is New Again, What QE4 Means for You. So I would suggest, if you haven't seen that yet, you go and read that or reread it to remind yourself of the fact that QE4 did again start in September of 2019. It was identified as such by many, many people, although the Fed insisted this isn't quantitative easing, guys. It's something totally different. But I'll let you judge that for yourself. And I'll also just advise you that there are multiple other interesting things that were taking place at that time, including the Dutch Central Bank, which was warning of a systemic collapse and talking about how gold reserves could serve as a basis for rebuilding the system after it collapses, and other such tectonic financial events that were taking place in the fall of last year, to the point where one can conclude that if some sort of global coronavirus pandemic freakout or some other type of international crisis necessitating the shutdown of the global economy didn't exist, that they would have to invent one to cover up the fact that this system, which has been designed and engineered to ultimately collapse, the Ponzi scheme that they're running, is finally coming to an end. But it's because of some black swan that we could never have predicted, right, guys? So this isn't direct evidence of foreknowledge of a pandemic per se, but it certainly is. It does line up to that broader theme that we are examining today of various ways that either this was understood that some sort of international crisis was going to come, or using that international crisis as a cover for other agendas. Let's move on to another form of this foreknowledge question surrounding the Plandemic. And again, this steps out of the bounds